So we welcome both of these authors today. We're really excited to celebrate this fabulous book, Culturally Responsive Design for English Learners. You can get a discount on the book using the code on the screen. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our authors and our presenters, and then we'll come back toward the end for some questions and answers.
All right. Thank you very much, David. That was wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So there you go, everybody. And I have to move my chat around. There we go. So welcome, everyone. And I'm Louie. You should see Patty in your list there also. Just a note to let you know. So Patty and I came to this talking about culturally responsive teaching and working with English learners, obviously through our love and deep honor to Universal Design for Learning. And we also came to this because we know that there are needs in areas of cultural responsiveness and equity within our school systems and within our classrooms. We also fully recognize that we are two white women and that we come from middle income backgrounds. So that causes us to listen a lot, to read a lot, to have a lot of conversations, and to learn from our peers. And while writing this book, we chose to have, you know, all those conversations, as I just noted. But we're committed to helping create a sea change, and of course, we see that all of us working on this together. We also recognize that that's going to take some really brave conversations. It also is going to take some course corrections every once in a while, us nudging one another as we grow and increase knowledge about this and implementation of it within the field. So we're hoping that you will grow and learn along with us. So all of that said, I'm going to go ahead and forward into our goal, which is to share an overview of how the UDL framework can be used to design culturally responsive environments for English learners. And with that, Patty's going to take this next part.
Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to be with you today, and Louie and Mindy and David and Nate and everybody at CAST and all of you from all over the world. It looks like. How exciting. We wanted to start this presentation with a discussion of why we decided that it was appropriate to braid, and we talk about it as braiding rather than some other kind of connection, to really braid the Universal Design for Learning framework with culturally responsive teaching. We do believe that together UDL and culturally responsive teaching lay a foundation for designing inclusive environments for all learners. That's one of the primary reasons why we decided to take a look at these two frameworks and see how they could work together. We also believe that as you look at the two frameworks, that it's important to keep in mind that they both have a lot in common. They both heighten collaborative, relative, and relevant, I should say, environments for learners. They focus on clarifying content and language. They connect academic content with language concepts. Both of them do that. They also encourage educators to offer meaningful, relevant expression options for all learners. And that's just the foundation of why these two particular frameworks, we think, work really well together as a braided format for designing your learning environments and your lessons. Let's go on to the next slide, Louie. we want to start with some common beliefs about learning, and really talk for a moment about what learning is. What the neuroscientists tell us is that there are synaptic patterns that are developed each time each one of us experiences anything. And this goes for us as adults as well as certainly for our learners, our younger learners. Every experience we have builds upon previous ones. And as a result, our experiences build over time, and our knowledge and our learning builds over time, and yet the foundation for our learning is embedded in our own cultural and linguistic environment, whatever that might be. And that's important to keep in mind. I love this symbol or representation that's on the slide that actually appears in our book, because it shows that as you have experiences, the neurons interact with other neurons, and synapses are formed, and they network through our brains. And so we really have multitude of connections in our brains that we can use as learners and as educators. We can use that concept of connection as we're planning our learning environments and our lessons. And every single brain is constantly developing all of these networks and connections. And because every brain and every learner experiences each experience differently, each brain is different, right? And those learning environments sculpt really our brains and our ability to learn and our ability to build on past experiences in order to learn new information. And it's important to keep that in mind as we do our planning for creating our learning environments and creating our lessons. Let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit about some key concepts that permeate throughout the book. Really, and it's all talking about what learning is. That, as I mentioned, learning is embedded in our cultural and linguistic backgrounds, but it's also embedded within the context of any learning environment. So that's important to keep in mind. Both UDL and culturally responsive teaching talk about context and culture. Learning is also linked with our social, cultural, linguistic, and personal identities. And that's really important when we're thinking about making learning relevant to learners. It's also important to keep in mind that learning is dynamic, and that what a learner knows one day, hopefully they'll learn even more and know more the next day. And it's really about not just context, but making connections in the context between new information and what we already know. And lastly, learning is about really choice. Choice in terms of what we want to learn. Personal choice as a learner, we feel is very important. You'll find that in the book. But also maintaining high expectations. Both UDL and culturally responsive teaching talk about maintaining high expectations and rigor for all learners, and not dumbing down in any way because a student might be having some struggles of some way, might be learning in a different way, may not have as many experiences as another learner. Maintaining that rigor is really important, and Louis is going to talk more about that in a few minutes. Building in flexibility and choice so that learners can make the learning relevant for them, and that's how they can make those connections and expand what they're learning in a way that's meaningful and long-term. Moving information from working memory to short-term memory, and then hopefully into long-term memory, so that it's content that learners can count on in their next learning experience, in the next context that they'll find themselves in. So we wanted to start this discussion with a bit of a review for most of you about what learning is, and really talk about the fact that UDL and culturally responsive teaching really both recognize and respect and address learner variability. And that was a key as we began to write the book. Both of them encourage educators to create engaging, meaningful, responsive, rigorous, inclusive learning environments. And that's why and how they work so well together. And we'll go on to the next slide then. So we wanted to ask you just real quickly, fist to five, how closely your personal identity is linked to how you describe yourself in terms of your cultural and ethnic background. Can you think about that and maybe put it in the chat, either a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 being that there isn't really very much of a connection, and 5 being that it's something that's just integral to everything that you do. The way that you describe yourself in terms of your cultural or ethnic background. Oh, look at all these numbers we got. They're all over the place. A lot of 4s, a lot of 5s I've seen. That's great.
Okay.
And that's important to keep in mind, that if we are making those kinds of linkages as learners, as adult learners, well, certainly our learners, our younger learners are doing the same thing.
Yeah, and I love seeing all of this variability. It's great. Wonderful. And I think the other part of it is that when we take that moment to reflect on where we sit and then give our students an opportunity to answer the same type of question and see where they sit, and then start to build those relationships. And now I'll get to talk about that more here. I'm going to give a quick review. These are 7 different principles that are identified by Brown University, and I use them because I think they've done a nice job of collecting the literature from across the field and comprehensively putting it together, using some of the greats and the names that we know and updated information. So I'm going to, like I said, talk through these, but at the end, then I'm going to give you some of the crosswalk pieces between these principles and then the principles of UDL. So at this point, you'll just be listening and learning about these 7 areas. So when we think about parents and families and positive perspectives with them, really, this is about seeing our families as learners, and it's respecting them as learners and anticipating that they want to be involved and that they want to learn. And from our end of the deal, it's providing them with information in a lot of different representations and engaging them in a lot of different ways and giving them different opportunities and ways to demonstrate their connection to school. And so you've probably already heard just from that brief sentence the overlay that you can already start to make between this principle within culturally responsive teaching and universal design for learning. When we think about some available resources, one of them comes from Teaching Tolerance, which is a website that's incredible if you haven't visited before. And there's a resource that will be placed in the chat box shortly. And specifically with that, there's an article in there on family engagement that I give you the link to. What I like about this particular piece is it talks about family engagement as a year-long endeavor. So it's not something you do at the beginning of the year and then you touch base during parent-teacher conferences, but they give you some succinct ideas that move through. And then also embedded are several videos and ideas that help you think about overcoming language barriers. So that might be a nice tool for you to use in retrospect of what we're talking about here. Another place that I'd like to take you is actually a website, and this one you can see on my screen. So this it's guide.swiftschools.org, and you can see that address up in the upper left-hand corner. This was a large federal grant, and this organization is still working with some states around the nation, but this was created, this database of sources and resources that are really valuable. What I'm going to do is scroll down to an area that says family and community engagement. And you can click on trusting family partnerships. You could also click on trusting community partnerships. But the key here is that the information you'll find is this is when family members have options for meaningful involvement with the school. And then also these resources are guided by that the school responds to family interest and involvement in culturally responsive manners and relationships. As you go down into it, you can watch a video that further gives you information about how they define family partnerships. But scroll down to the bottom and you're going to find resources that were collected specific to that definition on partnerships, tools, websites, and as you go through these, you will discover some resources that I think would be useful to you within this area. Okay. The next one, this is communication of high expectations. What are we talking about here? Well, we always go back to rigor, and rigor is a big conversation in our schools and within our field, and sometimes we have a difficult time communicating what that means. So Barbara Blackburn gives three overarching pieces to her definition. So high levels of learning are experienced by all students, and that all learners are supported so they can experience high learning, and then all learners can demonstrate their learning. That may feel a little big to touch on. So then let's go with Robin Jackson. And again, so Barbara Blackburn resource there in the chat box. You'll see Robin Jackson's a resource there for her. So she broke it down to 4 different pieces. Number 1, students make meaning for themselves. So they're taking the information, we're giving them opportunities and time to think about these and connect them to themselves. And if you read within the principle of engagement, you're going to see lots of different opportunities where it's suggested as a really good practice within Universal Design for Learning. They're going to make meaning for themselves, and that means, they're going to structure information, which they're going to take that information that's ambiguous or even just big, complicated stuff, and have time, again, to sort through that and connect that back to themselves. We want them to be able to move from skill building, so individual skills, to building and understanding larger processes and how they might move through a situation using those processes that they've investigated and created in their own heads. And then finally, we want them to apply new meaning to either real life situations or real world context, something complex. So when we look at these pieces of rigor, this is what we're expecting to have in our environments, and we need to have these in our culturally responsive environments. Next, learning within the context of culture. So this is all about the fact that students move between contexts. So we have the context of the classroom, which many of you on this call might be aware that in the US, it's recognized through lots of different literature and research that over 80% of our teachers are white, and our curriculum is geared toward our white students. And so we have some imbalance there. We have some significant imbalance there. So our students are within that context, but then they're in a different context when they're at home or within their communities. What this principle is all about is helping our students understand their cultural capital. What are they bringing from home? What are they bringing from their community that is an asset to their learning? Let's take the example of storytelling. Let's take the example of their family or their community has rich storytellers. How do we help them bridge that and bring that incredible asset into learning? Bring that into a way that they can express themselves. Bring that into how they're going to bring those ideas together that we just thought about with rigor. That's what we need to bring within that principle. So student-centered instruction, as this mentions, we're looking at collaboration. So while the teacher is a facilitator, this principle is more about focusing in on the students and that student center aspect, and 3 pieces there. So they're going to feel connected to their learning. Again, we see that with engagement. The scaffolds are going to help our students take the lead. Scaffolding, I think I've already mentioned it once, but scaffolding is kind of a tough conversation for some, because there's coming up with specific examples, or how do we break it down. And just recently, Lisa Carey at the Kennedy Krieger Institute created a blog about scaffolding, and then she also wrote about the difference between scaffolding and accommodations. So that link is going to be showing up in the chat box for you. You can check that out. And then I would also encourage you to read pretty much all the other blogs, because they're very powerful in taking information from, for example, the neurosciences, and making it applicable into classroom practice. So you'll have a nice bridge there, and things that you can just do based on what you've read in those blogs. The last step within here is students have to know the goal, and they have to know the expected outcome. That's all from UDL also, right? That aligns so well. But if we want to create student-centered learning, our students have to understand, what's the point? What am I going for? And then how am I going to be measured on this? And what's really beautiful is when our students are given the opportunity to help brainstorm and devise ways that they'll be assessed. And we also know that students are sometimes harder on themselves, or many times harder on themselves. But once they understand what the goal is, then they can start working through and devising those processes. And I'm hoping that you're hearing within this description how nicely, again, that overlaps with rigor, just talked about previously. So the culturally mediated instruction, the crux of this is developing these strong and positive relationships with our students. So getting to know and value our students, how they learn at home, how they learn in their communities. And a really nice resource in that is called, it's a culturally responsive classroom management strategies. And that one is put out by the New York University Metropolitan Center on Urban Education. It's a mouthful. Again, you'll see that in the chat box, but it's a relatively short, and maybe 4 or 5 pages PDF. But again, it breaks out some strategies to really think about how you can begin to build these positive and strong relationships. Then reshaping the curriculum. This is all about thinking about the issues that connect with student background in learning, rather than adapting the curriculum. So after the fact. So thinking up front rather than adapting. It's really parallel to UDL, where you design up front rather than retrofitting, right? So you can use the framework in that sense also. But we get to know, and we learn about that systemic variability that we know is going to be present. As Patty talked about in the beginning, we have learner variability. We know what it is. Many of you, if you stay in the same school, if you stay in the same classroom, but you know what students are coming, you know essentially the profile that's going on. You have curriculum teams, probably doing some curriculum mapping. So you bring these things in, these pieces, this background knowledge that you have about students and the cultures that are present, and you have that in there up front so that you're not having to retrofit in the end. Finally, teacher as a facilitator. This is focusing in on the teacher, but this is where it's us recognizing that we design the environment. We design what goes up on the walls, and what books go on the shelf, and how our students use the media within the classroom. And even though we might provide choice, we're still mapping out the choices that are there. Now, when we reach the point where students are helping to choose some of those things, that's great. But we really need to take responsibility of the fact that we establish that learning environment. So we're looking at the social and the cultural and the linguistic experiences of our students, bringing those in, helping them understand what those things are, and inviting them to bring those in to the environment also. So that is a part of being the teacher as the facilitator. as promised, because right now you might be thinking, what are some other UDL ideas? This chart gives you, across the top, I've listed the 7 different principles of culturally responsive teaching from Brown University. Underneath that, the row, principles of UDL, so I've just chosen one principle of the 3. And then below that is a UDL crosswalk. So for example, with parents and families, when we think of action and expression, the scenario, you have families who might not be English speakers, and so we're using multimedia tools when we're in a face-to-face meeting. But we need to make sure that these are effective tools for communication versus blocking communication. And I know that sounds silly, but I've actually been in meetings where everyone just thought they were doing such a great job of connecting with the families that were at the table and providing these great tools, but it was overwhelming for the families. And it was overwhelming in the sense of how the technology was being used. The language wasn't quite as accurate as it needed to be, and on and on. And then we never stopped and said, is this helping or is this getting in the way? So that's just one example. Under the expectations with representation, so commuting those high expectations consistently, the different modes and the different media. So how we communicate expectation, we do it in a variety of different ways. So tossing some of those suggestions that you have into the chat box would be great. But we know that our expectations, even in the side comments that we have to students, so even in the goals that we write, in the scaffolds that we provide to our students, in us saying, look, here's what you're working toward. I'm going to give you these 2 steps because I know you're going to make it up here. May take a little extra time, but I know you're going to get there. Having those short, brief conversations. Under engagement for the next, so guiding the students to explore those variety of coping skills, we want to provide them with some instances and examples that might link with their culture, but then also giving them opportunities to experience all sorts of different skills so that they can choose and reflect. Wow, this is different than what I've experienced before. This is different than what I've experienced in my context before, but you know what? This one works for me, or this one doesn't work for me. So conducting consistent check-in with our students so they can see how their day-to-day work is, that bigger picture. Having them share what makes sense for them. A bar graph doesn't work for every student, right? So what symbolic representation might they want to have? We usually think about this under action and expression, right? But this is all about the representation of it. How are students being able to see their progress? So the culturally mediated instruction, students having ample media opportunities to explore culture, both theirs and others. That's pretty straightforward. Engagement, so the students' cultural lives reflected within the curriculum. That gets to that forward planning, looking at it in the design rather than retroactively. And then the teacher is the facilitator, so the relevance and the value and the authenticity that's going to come from the students sharing about themselves and information that comes back from their home, comes from their own personal experiences.
So what Louis just went through was the connection, the braiding between culturally responsive teaching and UDL, using culturally responsive teaching as the base. Now what we're really going to be talking about is how do we use universal design for learning as the base when we're looking at culturally and linguistically diverse learners, particularly those learners who are learning English as a second or a dual language. This more and more children in our classrooms do not speak English as their first language. That doesn't necessarily mean they're immigrants. They may very well be living in a community where another language is the first language that they learn and not English. And so they are, in some instances, very large groups within the population of the school, and in other places, very small population within the school population. And we don't necessarily have the rich resources that you might have to address their English learning skills. So what we've done in the book for you is to connect what we know about learning English as a second language or a dual language with what we know about UDL. I did happen to see in the chat someone asking about the great chart that Louis had just put up, connecting the two frameworks. The book is replete with these kinds of charts. There are tons of them. And we did that specifically so that you can make that visual connection. And so if we have charts that look at each one of the UDL principles and the various aspects, the 7 principles of culturally responsive teaching as well. So let's go on to the discussion about UDL now. From a UDL perspective, these are the guidelines. I'm assuming, which hopefully I'm not wrong about, most of you have joined this webinar because you have at least a beginning understanding of universal design for learning. These are the guidelines that CAST developed and published in 2014. And they're organized in such a way, which you probably know, where the skills at the, or the guidelines towards the bottom of the chart are the building base, and as you move up the chart, you get higher and higher and more complicated and more complex kinds of skills, and that are addressed by more complex guidelines, frankly. How do we use the Universal Design for Learning guidelines and the 3 principles of UDL to address the learning needs of English learners? Well, we're going to look at this next slide. And what we've done here on this slide is to highlight for you the specific guidelines that we think, if you're thinking about where do I start, these are good ones to pick from if you're looking at the UDL guidelines. It doesn't mean that you ignore the others, because they're all important. But for English learners, one of the major issues you're going to find is, for example, recruiting their interest. How do you make your lesson or your learning environment culturally relevant for them? And how do you build in ways to sustain their interest and their effort? Because basically what they're doing in your classroom is they're doing double or triple duty. They're not only learning English and the rules of school in some instances, but they're also learning the content. And so they really, they get tired. It's hard work to do all of this translating and learning of all of these rules that, and complicated contexts that they might not, that are actually new experiences for them, that they might not be as familiar with. So certainly starting from engagement and thinking about recruiting their interest and sustaining their effort are really important to start with. But, and all of the guidelines, whoops.
Sorry.
Yeah, all of the guidelines, thanks. All of the guidelines under representation are critical because they're all related to language learning. So you really, and making meaning in a learning environment. So those are all critically important. And then also because of the need to be able to express themselves and express their learning in a way that you can understand what they know and what they don't know, what they've learned and what they haven't learned. These particular guidelines under action and expression, I think, are really important to keep in mind. So now let's go on to that next slide. Thanks. What we did here was that we're offering for you one example of one of the tables that's in the book that looks at how you might adjust your instruction to meet the needs of English learners in particular, as you look at the 3 UDL principles: engagement, representation, and action and expression. And some of these, I just want to mention a couple of them that Some of them are quite obvious, you know, make sure that you provide culturally appropriate choices, and you encourage them to use their prior knowledge and experiences and not have to leave all of their background at the door when they walk in. But some of them you may not be thinking about, like providing wait time. They need time to be able to translate from their first language to English and then back again to be able to respond to you. And so just providing a couple of seconds of wait time for them to process, it can make the difference in your classroom, from your classroom being a welcoming, comfortable environment to it being a stressful environment that causes them so much stress that they're not able to learn as quickly as they might. Some other concepts in here have to do with pre-teaching vocabulary, using the three-tiered model or the three-tiered approach. Some of you may be familiar with that, where you pick vocabulary that is basic, everyday kind of vocabulary at tier 1, and vocabulary that's more related to specific situations or more complicated English structures, like hair as it refers to a rabbit, and hair as it refers to what's on top of your head. Being able to do that, those are tier 2 kinds of words. And then in synonyms and antonyms belong in tier 2. And then moving up to tier 3, those are words that are specific to the content, academic vocabulary that might only be used in that particular lesson or that particular course. So being able to design your lessons so that you're keeping in mind what vocabulary you're using and what level it is can make the difference between you talking above them totally, or you being able to at least pick out a few words that in English that they're going to be able to remember and use again in the next lesson, in the next context that they head towards. So these are some examples of how you can apply the UDL guidelines under each one of the UDL principles to address the learner variability, the linguistic and cultural variability that exists among English learners. One other really important point is that English learners are not the same. It's not a homogeneous group. I don't think that that's a big wow kind of statement. I think we always, all of us kind of realize that, but it's important just to say it to make sure that people aren't saying, well, all my English learners are going to be over here and I'm going to give them all the same stuff or the same lesson or the same supports or the same scaffolds. Well, they're just as variable as any other group of learners, and so we can't do this one-size-fits-all for them either. I did see in the chat somebody's interested in some video resources. There's a great site for video resources specifically for English learners. They don't really talk about universal design for learning, but as you read or watch the videos that they have, they are obviously applying a lot of what is relevant to UDL in their teaching. And it is the, of course, it's gone right out of my mind now. The Colorado, I'll think about it. It'll come back to me later. Maybe somebody else knows and can put it in the chat and save me the time. But when Louie's talking later, there it is, Coloring Colorado. There, that's it. Thank you. That's it. Coloring Colorado. Look for that, Google for that, and you'll find a number of videos. There's one about collaborating to build a story, which is really, I think, quite excellent. I show it in a lot of the workshops that we do. So moving on to the next piece of information that we wanted to share with you. Many of you may be familiar with the stages of language development that English learners or dual language learners go through. This set of 5 stages was actually developed by Hill and Miller, and I like it, and I like the way they describe these different stages because they talk not just about what students could do at each one of these stages, but they also give you an idea of how long it would be typical for a student to be in that stage. So that if this is brand new to you, you can get a sense of how long you're going to be able to expect a student to have needs in a certain area. But there are 5 stages that they talk about. The pre-production silent reception. Basically, the kids are brand new to English within the first 6 months of their exposure, and they really, they don't respond very much. Early production is the next stage where they're just beginning to use some language, and then speech emergence, intermediate language fluency, and advanced language fluency. And I actually describe these better in the next slide so that you can take a look at some of the descriptions in the very next slide. See, there it is. So you'll see too in this slide, and this is discussed in detail in the book. In the first stage, the students might have about 500 words, but they really rarely speak. They're not very confident about their abilities. So they use gestures and pointing, and they will respond yes or no to a yes-no question. But they're going to be very uncomfortable being placed in a situation where they have to be extremely verbal. And this is a good time to be pairing them with another learner who speaks their first language as well, so that they have that support, or providing them with other kinds of translation supports in the classroom, and allowing them to use their first language to make their point when they need to. And then as you look at the different levels or stages, you see how their vocabulary doubles, and then it triples, and then it doubles again. And by the time they get to the advanced language proficiency stage, they're near peer, English speaking peer at that point. Yeah, and they really do, they're able by then to use content vocabulary appropriately. Let's move on to the next slide, and you'll see here that these are examples of some strategies that you can use to support the English learning at each one of the stages, so that the students can progress in their English language learning as they're learning the content, which is a critically important aspect to think about with your English learners. We need all of us to be responsible for teaching them language. If you're a science teacher, if you're a social studies teacher, you're also a language teacher for an English learner in your classroom. So knowing how to support their language development through the 5 stages is a really important thing to do. And lastly, there are other stages that are available from WIDA. Some of you may be familiar with it, WIDA. And there is a great site. The WIDA site has all kinds of resources. I highly encourage you to take a look at that as well. They have 6 stages rather than 5, but they're very comparable to these 5 stages. And we can move on, I think.
All right, so we have, so in the Q&A, and we do have some questions that have come in, and we're going to be working on that too. You know, it's the balance, right, between paying attention to one another and paying attention to the fast-moving texting that's going on. So our questions, your answers. We'd love for you to share if you'd like, based on the questions that we're asking. You can reflect with your peers and add to the conversation. And we'll be picking out some of these things also and chatting about them. But what is, so for example, what is surprising about the braiding we've suggested between culturally responsive teaching and UDL? Was there anything surprising in there to you?
You're thinking.
Yeah.
A perfect fit. Absolutely. Thinking. Yes, right. Good question. Which framework came first, UDL or culturally responsive teaching? I think they were pretty much simultaneous. Louis, you may know something else about that, but It seems to me that they were, CAST was looking at universal design for learning in the 90s, and that's in the 80s and 90s is when I started to hear and learn about culturally responsive teaching. The thing about culturally responsive teaching that's important to keep in mind is that there are lots of different ways of looking at it, and lots of people out there with different kinds of principles. What we've done with the book and looking at Brown University's 7 principles is we've kind of consolidated them, but you'll find other principles that other people suggest. It makes perfect sense. Could you give an example of how you would design up front rather than after the fact, I think it was, rather than retrofit? That was something you were talking about. Louie, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, so the designing up front is thinking about, so if we're going to speak specifically about culturally responsive teaching, I know that in my classrooms, for example, I knew what groups were present within my school. And I knew that, for example, that we had Hispanic, we had Latino, we had Black American, we had white, we had several different Asian cultures that were represented. So there were pieces that we could bring in and have some representation. But and when I talk about that, we were thinking hard about what kind of literature would the students be reading. What kind of examples would be given? What kind of names are going to be given as examples? And so do they reflect or something that's similar? Games that we were going to be playing. And again, that's the forward thinking, and it's purposeful. So just like we do with universal design for learning, it's in the purpose. It's saying, I'm going to purposefully think about this with intention of, I want to create this support. And then as you get to know your students over time, there was someone else who was asking a question about, all these different cultures that are in there and how, the representation of all these different, all the different cultures. And I said, think about that example that's really popular of the one teacher who said, if my teacher could just know one thing about me, and that really created this social media windstorm. Something similar to that. If there was some one thing that I wish my teacher knew about my culture, if there was one thing that I wish my teacher knew about how I learn at home, if there was one thing that I wish my teacher knew about what I do so well in the community, all of these things touch on culture, and you can bring that information in, and you can weave it in over time. I think the other thing that we do is we pressure ourselves to start now and jump in, and we get overwhelmed. So start collecting the information, and with intention and with purpose, start to weave these things in.
And another thought that I had as you were talking, and I saw one of the comments here was about, well, how do you handle multiple languages in a classroom? We're living in a fortunate time in that there are digital apps that will help to translate a variety of languages. Google Translate is one of them. There are others. And just being able to, you don't have to know the language, you don't have to know everything about the student's culture, but giving them the choice, the option, the opportunity to do that translating themselves, or the choice to offer a culturally relevant student product in your classroom. For example, let me say it this way. You're studying the Civil War, and you have a number of Chinese students in your classroom. Well, maybe a choice for them in terms of looking at their final product might be, what happened to the Chinese during the Civil War? We had Chinese in this country. How were they engaged? How were they impacted by that? That might be much more culturally responsive and interesting to them, more relevant to them, than talking about other aspects of the Civil War. So do we have any other questions? Let's look at our next question. Yeah. Looking at your own instructional design through the lens of culturally responsive teaching in UDL, what is one way you might alter your design for English learners in particular? And just, you know, you can think about that for a couple seconds and see what you might do after this webinar that would be a way that you could redesign what you're doing for your English learners. Adding waiting time. Great. Thank you, Eunice. More student choice. Absolutely. Helping your students to help you plan. What a great idea. I love it. Using better images with material usage and technique. I'm not sure exactly. Oh, you teach art. Okay, got it. That's perfect. Remember, oh, okay. I was going to read you just your directions, Mindy. Helping our students to think about how they learn at home, what they know at home. That's a very important thing. Yeah. Sometimes we get stuck in this, well, let's learn about their food or, you know, their dress, their culture. And there's a lot more culture than that. That's a very surface level description and exposure to culture. We really need to get into, you know, what really are the priorities for the family at home, for the community. Dig deeper. Yes, Amanda, absolutely. And honor what they do. Giving them the option and then asking them, why did you do it that way? You know, what was your rationale for that? It may look like something that you didn't actually ask for. And then when you dig in and you ask them what was their rationale, you find out that it's very related to what you actually asked for. You just didn't happen to view it that way because you had a different worldview. See, love the open-ended question approach. More recognition of the diverse perspectives. Following up on Louis' suggestion about asking them one thing they wish I knew about their culture or their community or their history, their background. Mm-hmm. And providing them multiple flexible options. Flexibility and choice are key when you're applying UDL, and it complements culturally responsive teaching as well. Well, you know, I think Claire points out the idea that some students don't want to talk about their background, and we need to respect that as well. That's their choice. They may have some very good reasons for why they don't want to be sharing with you. It may be uncomfortable for them for whatever reason. And that's what we do with students when we honor that choice. Mm-hmm. It is possible that it will take time for them to feel comfortable, absolutely. But building a welcoming classroom environment takes time. But making it as personally relevant for your students, offering as many choices and flexibility. One thing that we recommend in the book is as you're describing the goal of your lesson, which you should do at the beginning or at some point towards the beginning of every lesson, you should always make sure your students know what it is that's expected of them, what the goal is. Ask them to look at the goal and make it personal for them. what in this lesson are you going to learn, and what are you going to take away from this lesson personally? It makes a huge difference in how much they actually glean from the lesson. Any other things there that that's very important with adult learners, about making it personal, I think, Leslie, is what you're referring to. Yes, absolutely. But also our younger learners can pick out what part they want to learn about, and they can do it in a way that makes the lesson meaningful to them. It looks like David has joined us, and I'm wondering if he wants to help us summarize this. This is our summary slide here, just some basic points we want to leave you with, that, as I said earlier, make sure you focus on both language and content or academic learning goals when you're designing your learning environment and your lessons. Make sure that your instruction is culturally relevant, that you offer choices for students, and that you support them and scaffold them, that maintain high expectations of all of your learners. Don't lower your standards because some of them are struggling. What you should be doing is supporting them so that they can meet those expectations. And then make sure you plan for that variability using UDL and using the 7 principles that we've identified through Brown University's work of culturally responsive teaching.
Thank you, Patty. And Louie, just what a tremendous hour this has been, and it's gone by so quickly. I want to encourage everyone to get the book. We've got a special deal, 25% off today on this and all of the CAST books. So it's Cyber Monday on Tuesday here at CAST. So I hope you enjoy that opportunity and take advantage of it. I also want to send a big shout out to our captioner, Nicole, to Mindy Johnson, who, as always, our social media director, does a fabulous job behind the scenes answering questions, and to my colleague Nathan Treitz, who produced this program today and did a whole lot of work to make it run so smoothly. Thank you, everyone, and look for our next webinar in January, December 13th. I'm a month ahead here. December 13th with Katie Novak. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.